AI chips that would go to UAE. The National Security Advisor of UAE is also the CEO of MGX. So after that request for those chips occurred, MGX then said, we will buy 2 billion with a B, of the president's coins. And then the president went to the Middle East and said, we will get you those AI chips. Does this sequence of events in which a foreign government asked for a big favor, and we had previously banned these chips to UAE because of the national security concerns, then they buy $2 billion of the president's coins, and then the president goes to the Middle East and says, we will provide those chips. Does that sequence of events concern you about foreign influence on the United States of America?
The foreign influence on America that I would be concerned about if I were you was the Mexican national that resided in Oregon, who we just arrested, who had 384 pounds of methamphetamine. The foreign individual who I would be concerned about if I were a senator from Oregon is the Honduran drug trafficker who was residing in Portland for distributing fentanyl. The foreign national I would be concerned about if I was a Portland senator, an Oregon senator, is a Mexican national leader of a drug trafficking ring. Another one, fentanyl, firearms, fatal overdoses, all in your state.
You have made your point.
57,700 fentanyl pills and stolen firearms in Oregon. That's what we should work together on, not gotcha questions during a budget hearing.
Let me recognize Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Attorney General certainly has made the point that she's very concerned about issues that I'm concerned about as well regarding the security of this country. But let the record note that in terms of foreign influence and the sale of foreign influence through the president's coins, she absolutely refuses to respond and instead turns to a whole list of different topics. I think it's important for the leader of the Justice Department of the United States to be very concerned about foreign influence, and I encourage you to take on that topic and not consider it an offense that those of us who are concerned here, Democrats and Republicans, want Americans to make American decisions, not foreign influence being bought through crypto coins.
I am your host, Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones, the film the Kremlin doesn't want you to see, so be sure to watch it. Recent reporting reminds us that Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of the United States, paid with our tax dollars, is now serving as Donald Trump's personal attorney. Reports suggest Trump talks to her throughout the day and directs her to target his perceived enemies, including judges who dare to uphold the law in an effort to curb his lawlessness. It's straight out of the Roy Cohn playbook, with Bondi reduced to little more than Trump's executive assistant. Other accounts paint a damning picture of Bondi, an ineffective lawyer elevated within the Florida GOP, not for her legal skill, but for her ambition, photogenic appeal, and talent for Fox News-style soundbites. In truth, she functions more like a gopher, carrying out Trump's vindictive whims with little regard for ethics or justice. But following orders didn't save the Nazis at Nuremberg, and it won't save Pam Bondi when her time comes. Under Trump and Bondi's influence, the Department of Justice has been hollowed out and reshaped into a political weapon. Pardoned January 6th rioters now walk DOJ hallways, career prosecutors have been fired or resigned in protest, and so-called weaponization panels have been launched to investigate the investigators. A convicted felon is now using the machinery of justice to target law enforcement itself, an authoritarian power grab that threatens the very foundation of American democracy. Last week, along this thread, the Washington Post editorial board sounded the alarm with a stark warning. Donald Trump's weapons freeze on Ukraine could bring catastrophe. Obviously, Donald Trump slamming the brakes on critical U.S. military aid to Ukraine, including vital Patriot air defense systems, puts lives directly in danger. With Russian missile and drone attacks intensifying, Trump continuing to delay, deny aid to Ukraine harms Ukraine's ability to defend itself and emboldens Russia. Why might he want to do that? Just look at every previous episode of Gaslit Nation to understand what we're dealing with. just as Trump ensured that MAGA Mike Johnson held up Ukraine aid in Congress for 6 critical months, giving Russia the upper hand on the battlefield. Denying or even delaying aid to Ukraine only helps Russia on the battlefield. Trump claims he's only trying to push Ukraine to the negotiating table, but Ukraine has already tried negotiating with Russia repeatedly, even during Trump's presidency. Russia, the aggressor, continues to reject compromise and refuses to end the war it started. This is not about peace, it's about conquest. And another clear, blazing 5-alarm fire that Trump is aligned with Russia. No other credible bank would lend to him, and then along came the Russians with their easy, dirty money. One developer who worked in the post-Soviet states right after the fall of communism said the Russians had just faucets full of money. The capital was always there. It was the easiest place to get boatloads of cash for projects. Trump grew rich and powerful off of that, and credible institutions, credible people were burned by him, and he became increasingly a laughingstock in the business world. But the Russians kept him going, kept him afloat through all of those bankruptcies. And remember, Mark Burnett originally wanted to do a reality TV show on Putin, and then suddenly he pivots to Trump, and The Apprentice comes along and convinces Americans across this country, including in flyover country in those swing states, that Trump was a credible businessman, a tough, efficient executive who knew how to hire and fire top talent. It's been this long game all along because the Kremlin is notorious at playing the long game. They plant their seeds, and when they need to, like when they were getting hit by sanctions for invading Ukraine in 2014, and those sanctions were clobbering their economy and isolating them on the global stage, suddenly Trump comes back swinging. And it's been, do I think they're all in some ice cave together like Superman villains plotting all this around a world map like a Stanley Kubrick film? No, it's more organic than that. It is just birds of feather flock together. They share the same materialist values, and they use the same Christian nationalists to come to power and stay in power. It's just the culture of corruption. It is the culture of oligarchy and oligarchic ambitions. That is what is the core of this. That is the engine that fires off all these horrible things we're now dealing with now. All right. So one of the other clear signs to strengthen this case, by the way, along the lines of the DOJ, is that one of the first things that Trump did when he came back into power was dismantle the DOJ's kleptocracy capture, a unit that seized Russian oligarch yachts and hunted down their hidden fortunes around the world. Trump scrapped it immediately as soon as he came back in. Again, it's like he's repaying the Russians for their illegal efforts all these years to help bring him to power twice. And for more on the dangers posed by Trump and Russia, united by greed, oligarchy, and Christian nationalism, here's part 2 of our conversation with Russian analyst and ex-evangelical Chrissy Stroop. A sharp critic of Christian nationalism, Stroop walks us through how we got here, from Reagan's alliance with the religious right to today's terrifying convergence of American theocrats and Vladimir Putin's authoritarian regime. She breaks down how the homeschooling movement, anti-abortion crusades, and power-hungry religious leaders built the bulldozer of our democracy. But before we get to all that, let's ask, what happens when a billionaire who helped build a global surveillance empire openly questions whether humans should even exist? Here's billionaire and J.D. Vance political patron Peter Teal being interviewed by Ross Douthat.
You would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
yes?
I don't know. I would.
This is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit in this.
Should the human race survive?
Peter Teal is, of course, the founder of Palantir Technologies, a company that first became embedded in the Department of Justice during Trump's first term. One DOJ prosecutor told me they became dependent on Palantir for tracking criminals. And now, under Trump's second term, Palantir is reportedly building a massive database to help him track all of us. You'll find that reporting linked to in the show notes. Now, the odd thing is that Teal named the company after the Palantiri, the seeing stones from the Lord of the Rings, used to spy across vast distances. But here's the twist. In Tolkien's universe, the Palantiri weren't inherently evil, but in the hands of villains, they became dangerous. Saruman believed he can control the seeing stone, but Sauron used it to manipulate him, feeding him fear and deception. Saruman, thinking himself master, was instead pulled into darkness. Simply put, that all-seeing power backfired. A warning to Peter Teal: be careful what you think you're controlling. Now, here's Christy Stroop. I want to ask you about going back to this intersection between our Christian nationalists. Because when the evangelical movement decided if we all vote the same way, we'll be unstoppable. And that's how they got Reagan elected. And they just kept building and building from there. And that same Christian nationalist thread is what joined forces with Russia. And Trump rode that wave because he was financially dependent on Russia. And he always said if he ever ran for president, he would run as a Republican because they're so stupid. And now here we are, everybody. And so I want to ask you, could you talk about the history of how the Party of Reagan became the Party of Putin?
Yeah, great observations and great questions. And it is funny on its face, given that generation, and we're talking, half a century ago, in the late Cold War, this is when the mostly white, right-wing evangelical Protestant demographic in the United States got their first taste of real political power. The 1980 election, it's the year I was born, oddly enough. So I was born into this Reagan Revolution, and that's, partly why I was told from as early as I can remember that abortion is murder and these liberals are horrible people because they kill babies, right? They tell 2-year-olds this. I mean, obviously I don't really probably have memories of being 2, but at 5, I definitely remember hearing this, So you're absolutely right that it started then, and you can go back a little bit into the 70s and look at who was planning this. In the 70s is this big period of institution building, and it is also this first major period of Catholic Protestant coordination politically to try to capture some political power. So you look at Paul Weyrich, who's Catholic, and Phyllis Schlafly is Catholic, and they're getting together with people like Jerry Falwell Sr., who's, Baptist fundamentalist, evangelical, and talking about what they can do to, basically cement Nixon's Southern strategy and continue to grab power for Republicans.
And the Southern strategy is the whites must prevail. William F. Buckley wrote Why the South Must Prevail, which is basically the Southern strategy, saying the whites got to keep whiting.
Sure. It's hear, and you think about in that era too about Lee Atwater, and this is,
you can't say the N-word, but you can say
post-integration.
Let's close these polling places, so it makes it harder to vote.
How do we stop integration? Well, back in the 60s, you can say N-word, 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 and that wins the elections. Now you can't say that anymore. So you start talking about abstract things, but there's still, but what happens is whites benefit more than African Americans. So what you say is you're talking about busing, you're pushing back on affirmative action, you're pushing back on
voter ID laws to stop people from illegally voting.
Where it went, he didn't think about that.
No, of course, but they kept evolving it. They kept being more innovative.
But anyway, so Weyrich, and he founds the Heritage Foundation. So the groundwork is being laid for this in the 1970s, right? I think the Council for National Policy is founded then. Interestingly enough, in the early 1970s, that's also when Focus on the Family is founded, which is a major powerhouse in the evangelical information ecosystem, right? Founded by this guy named Dr. James Dobson, whose mentor in psychology was a eugenicist. Dobson doesn't say eugenicist things out loud, but he writes tons of books, and he did a radio show for decades and decades, and his organization is still huge, even though he's like old as dirt and basically retired from it. He became super influential in his books like Dare to Discipline, Preparing for Adolescence.
Oh, wow. Dare to Discipline. Isn't he's that authoritarian that teaches beating your kids?
Yeah, you're probably thinking about Talia Lavin's work on this. She talked to a lot of ex-evangelicals about this. Yeah, Dobson really pushes this idea. And, spare the rod, spoil the child. It's in the book of Proverbs, I believe. It's in the Bible. But that you've got to use physical discipline. You've got to use corporal punishment on children to keep them in line. And in fact, if you have a strong-willed child, that was a term that he used a lot. You've got to break their will. So, the worst that my sister and I got growing up was being hit with a wooden spoon. Occasionally they would break. But we didn't get belts or anything.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And only over the butt. So, I mean...
Well, no, that's still
it's bad.
Horrible.
It's
I'm
bad.
sorry.
It's abuse, but other people had it worse. Thanks. There are people in these circles and in homeschooling and Christian schooling communities who talk about how, those really long glue sticks you can get. If you hit kids with those, they won't leave bruises. They openly discuss things like this to talk about how to avoid CPS and
Child Protective Services and how to get away with beating your child.
Yeah, because they believe it's a divine imperative. And that's pretty typical for authoritarian communities to use corporal punishment as a means of literally beating people into the ideology. So James Dobson, that's that guy. He starts his big organization in the 1970s, and then the Heritage Foundation, Council for National Policy, and so Paul Weyrich and
sorry, before you get to Paul Weyrich again, what is James Dobson's organization called?
Focus on the Family.
Focus on the Families. Go on. So we've got Focus on the Families, and the Heritage Foundation, which gave us Project 2025.
Yeah, there's a couple of organizations that people who didn't grow up around evangelicals or evangelicals may not be aware of that are really important lobbying organizations. One is Focus, which don't quote me on this, but founded around 72, 73, something like that. The other one I like to call the sort of single most important Christian right lobbying institution you've never heard of is the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, founded in, I believe, 1982, right around there. And they are almost single-handedly responsible for the deregulation of homeschooling across the states in American federalism.
Which endangers the lives of children.
Absolutely. So, I'm not going to say homeschooling is never the right choice under certain circumstances.
But you want oversight.
But oversight is important.
Yes,
that was definitely the but I was going to add.
Yes, in homes, the number one way of dealing with a bully is getting a third party involved. And so if there's a homeschooling situation that's being abused, administered by a bully who's physically beating, making sure his children are being physically beaten, you need a third party involved to make sure that's not happening.
Children
and we don't have that
medical
anymore.
Care, and a lot of kids are deprived of that in homeschooling communities. They don't get proper medical care. They basically never see mandated reporters. They're having huge, huge gaps. Not only that their education has this ideological skew, but they're getting just huge gaps in their education. Some of them don't even come out functional outside of the evangelical bubble.
This is the real QAnon movement. The left needs to get its shit together and rise up around this issue, like homeschooling
this
oversight.
This is a real conspiracy, and in fact, I have extensively documented it, and so have other people, like people at Political Research Associates, Catherine Joyce in particular. They strategized to exploit the pandemic to get more people into homeschooling and radicalize them through Christian homeschooling programs.
And now they have the whole trad wife phenomenon, where they're glamorizing women being domestic servants in the home. So they're trying to keep women and children under the tight fist of patriarchy.
That is exactly it. During the COVID pandemic, I researched this. So if you like, you can put it in the show notes. So for people who are like, that's a conspiracy theory, here's all the reasons it's not, right?
Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes so people see.
Here is chapter and verse. Yeah.
Okay, so keep going with how the Party of Reagan. So they fought on the home front, basically, quite literally. They understood to transform society into a fascist dictatorship, they had to revolutionize starting from the home.
Right, and very few of them would probably even now call themselves fascists, although they are. But back then, they certainly would have balked at the term. You wouldn't have prominent figures throwing Nazi salutes publicly, because that wouldn't have flown back then. But the seeds are absolutely there. So they found these institutions, but how are you going to rally these people and get them to all vote for one party and then shape that party, right? That's what Weyrich and Falwell and some people around them figure out they can use abortion to do. So when the Roe decision is passed, there's not this huge outcry from conservative Christians. There simply isn't. We think that happened because that's this narrative that has been pushed by, the anti-choice side for decades. But there was no immediate big outcry over Roe. Falwell and Weyrich, I think this was particularly Weyrich's evil genius, figured out that if they could get evangelicals to come around on abortion to see it as murder, then it would be easy to get Catholics and evangelicals, even if they looked askance at each other, didn't particularly like each other, to vote the same way and to come out for the same, sort of political activism and advocacy, political events, and to act as a bloc. And so they start doing this anti-abortion propaganda, and holy wow, does it work? So it's the late 1970s when evangelicals, as such, are like staunchly opposed to abortion. Before that, you had a number of Southern Baptist ministers who were like defending Roe, or who were just like, it's just not that big of a deal to us. We don't think about it that much. It's kind of messy. God forgives. Let's move along. And the thing was, abortion was a Catholic issue, so Protestants didn't care. That all changed by the late 1970s, thanks to the work of these guys. And now their institutions start to have a bigger power base. And it all comes to a head in 1980 and gets Ronald Reagan elected with the backing of evangelical Protestants, to whom he famously said, you can't endorse me, but I endorse you, right?
What a charmer, that Reagan.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, he was.
Yeah, he was an actor.
Yeah, I saw this documentary once, and I'm forgetting the title of it off the top of my head, but Reagan told all these jokes on the campaign trail, right? This is one of the famous things about him, is that he used humor to disarm his political opponents. And it would seem like it was off the cuff, but actually he had like file drawers full of jokes. He studied them.
Wow.
He had a bunch of joke books. Some of them he wrote himself. He wrote these things on index cards. And so it was actually very studied. The reason I actually got into like searching for that sort of thing was that when I taught, Russian history and Cold War history and stuff, I got fascinated by Reagan actually telling Soviet jokes. He had someone take anekdoti from the Soviet Union and translate them for him, and he would tell them.
So he was obsessed with his enemy, basically, trying to get their emotional...
So there's some fascinating footage of this. One of the jokes goes, so there's a couple of guys walking through Moscow, downtown Moscow, just looking around at everything, all the wonders of modern Soviet civilization. And, one of these fellas says to the other fella, do you think this is full communism? Do you think this is it? And the other fellow says, oh no, things are going to get a lot worse. Yeah, that cynical sense of humor, it's definitely still present in Russia. But anyway, so from the 1980s, how do we get to where we are today? So evangelicals, they rally around Republicans. They always try to push them towards anti-LGBTQ and anti-abortion stances as hard as possible. But they're not thrilled with the results that they get for the most part. Even though to any normal observer so anyone who's actually like, not seeing politics as a zero-sum game, but as liberal democracy, they're getting a lot, right? But they're not getting everything they want. So they continue pushing a radical agenda, expanding homeschooling and the deregulation of homeschooling across the country, getting more students into Christian schools, and eventually creating like Patrick Henry College, which is a place for homeschoolers to go, an evangelical college for homeschoolers to go to then get higher education, get a degree, and be pushed into political programs, right? So many of them get internships, or they get to be congressional pages, or they get to be staffers. The whole point of this is to try to influence politics. And that certainly was the idea that I grew up with too. So at Heritage, I like to call it the elite culture warrior track, because the Heritage Christian School is where I graduated from in Indianapolis, because like they did actually teach us a lot of knowledge and skills so that we could go out into the world and do things effectively. There was just a lot of ideology. They offered some AP classes even at that time. So I'm class of 99. think they had 3 official AP classes at that time, and then a calculus class that wasn't officially AP, but students who took it would take the AP exam and often get college credit for calculus. I took AP English, AP Biology of all things, and got 5s on both exams. But the funny thing about AP Biology is that there's so many funny things about that class, actually, but we had an AP approved textbook, which meant it was a regular secular college textbook with everything about evolution and whatever. The teacher told us he could not in good conscience teach us the evolution chapters. But he also told us, go home, read those chapters, study them, be ready to regurgitate them for the AP exam, which is how I learned that lying for Jesus is just fine because the ends justify the means, right? So you're supposed to reject evolution, but you don't tell the AP examiners that. You just give them the answers the way they want. And the idea is that people coming out of that school, and it's self-selecting, right? There weren't vouchers at that time, or not very many. I don't remember exactly when those started. So the average student there was much richer than like me. My parents worked in ministry. If you have a parent who's on faculty or staff at the school, they're expected to send their kids there. They used to give you a full tuition waiver, but then it became like just a discount that increased with seniority. And that's pretty standard across Christian schools in the United States. So, yeah. And there was a time, like in middle school, I actually kind of wanted to, I got to go to public school for 1 semester, the second half of 6th grade, because it happened with when we moved. And then I wanted to stay there, but they wouldn't let me. My mom had a teaching job at Colorado Springs Christian School, so I had to go there. And the only way to change that would have been to like get myself expelled, which I was never ever going to do.
So, so now that the Christian right, I just want to go back to the rise of the right and Trump, because it's just because now these hardcore Christians are like rallying around Putin in America. Like when you see headlines that Elon Musk is illegally mass purging our government, and obviously they're not going to be reading these headlines. Let's be clear. Elon Musk, he killed an estimated 300,000 people so far with his
killing USAID.
With this /USAID. And that estimate could reach up to over 3 million people this year if that aid's not restored. So Elon Musk, he checks all the boxes of being a mass murderer. And then we find out in the New York Times and the reporting that he was drugged up while doing this. Not that he really needed it. I mean, given that he was raised by like a pro-apartheid South African Nazis. But Elon Musk, mass murderer, did this all through Trump's administration, sanctioned by Trump. Are the evangelicals, the Christian right, are they like, yes, this is what we want, mass murdering the poorest people on this planet? I don't remember Jesus saying that in the Gospels.
I mean, they wouldn't put it in those terms. But I do think most, and I haven't necessarily seen, I don't know what the latest public opinion data is on evangelicals supporting Musk, or if we even have that separated out from like Musk's approval
rating.
But
it's Trump, Musk, Trump. It's the same White House that did it. I mean, Trump can try to distance himself all he wants, but like,
I mean, typically, I think if you press an evangelical on this, they're going to tell you that, look, we had to take a pause to stop the trans comic books or whatever, which is also not something that was funded by USAID. But I've seen some of our evangelical family friends like celebrating Musk doing all this thing. And then if you look to like evangelical aid organizations, though, it's very mixed. So I see their press releases. And some evangelical and Catholic organizations are clearly like distraught at having lost their funding. The more sort of moderate ones are, not that they'd really be moderate in their views on issues like abortion and LGBTQ rights, but they want this aid to keep flowing. They don't like seeing people suffering that they have been able to give aid to. And they are kind of quietly saying, we would really like this aid to be restored. But then you have other people like Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, who's he's got this aid organization called Samaritan's Purse.
Billy Graham's purse.
Which, by the way, we know, and this is typical of evangelical organizations, but it's interesting that we actually have the information. We know that to work for Samaritan's Purse, you have to sign an agreement with the idea that marriage is between one man and one woman. There should be no sex outside of marriage. Like, you have to sign on to all this stuff just to even work with the organization, all this anti-LGBTQ stuff. So he actually came out and said, I think it's a good thing we're taking the pause. Samaritan's Purse is not really going to have to cut back on our programs. Well, yeah, because you're Samaritan's Purse, but you don't. I read about this maybe a couple months ago. Don't quote me on this, but I think they were getting around 15% of their funding Or maybe it was less than that. So not a massive percentage of their funding from
right. As long as they can uphold their luxurious lifestyle,
they're a rich organization, and he's saying it's not really going to affect our programs. And look, it had to be done to get the wokeness out. So that's one very prominent Trump-supporting evangelicals line on the thing. But more rank and file, but less household namey people who are actually doing the work abroad in evangelical and Catholic organizations, they're like, this is bad. But nobody's really hearing them, I don't think. I read the press releases, don't know who else does.
So, well, obviously not Trump. What's really interesting to me is that when we've spoken about this over the years is how the Reagan Revolution, waging war against the atheist empire of the Soviet Union. And so all the Christian nationalists that brought Reagan to power, they saw themselves as waging a holy crusade. And so when they finally defeated the evil empire, and all of those conservatives, they flocked to Moscow to dance on the ashes and help the Russians massively, rapidly privatize everything that was nationalized. And that gave birth to the oligarchs. And those oligarchs under Putin's KGB dictatorship were like, we're now Christian nationalists embracing the church, which they always had the church because the Russian Orthodox Church was always just an arm of the KGB. They had their priests abroad as spies and as well as spying on the congregation.
Yeah, I mean, since I wouldn't say the entire church is or has been, but since 1943, when Stalin reached a rapprochement with...
Oh, yes, of course. That was all under Stalin and his paranoia.
And undid, some of what had been done during the earlier revolution when many churches have been destroyed, shut down.
Stalin was like, oh, the church could actually be useful.
Yeah, if they will pray for a victory against the fascists, then we will let them have some theological education again after the war, because that had been banned in early Soviet times. So at that point, every high-ranking bishop was 100% reporting to the KGB, was an asset. Some were in it, but for the most part, probably they were assets. I don't think every parish priest was per se, but they were part of that system.
Yeah, and that's why
there were, of course, some very interesting dissident priests. Underground priests.
Absolutely.
Although some of those people then became right-wing wackos.
Yeah. So the larger story is that once the Cold War, first round of the Cold War, let's say, because we're in the second round of it right now, that Putin is waging again, once that was finished, so basically the Republicans, American Christian nationalists, and the KGB dictatorship under Yeltsin and Putin realized that they could work together to make a lot of money and to suppress their shared enemy, democracy and wokeness.
So, your Christian right ideologues, they were less interested in making money than getting in there and trying to convert Orthodox Christians, often under the guise of aid or mutual programs. You've got the diplomats and bureaucrats prescribing shock therapy. And you've got Yeltsin, who's kind of clueless. And I'm not sure that privatization would have gone a lot better if we could imagine a different West. But I would say that I think the West did make it worse with this economic shock therapy. I think Yeltsin could have been swayed to do things in a still very cronyistic way, but less extreme capitalist, perhaps, without all these Western diplomats around him telling him, the free, super free market, that's the way of the future. Just destabilize everything now. That will have no consequences. People need to just grow up and get jobs and bootstrap themselves.
Right. And as a result, you had Russians carrying around bananas like they were a Chanel purse because bananas suddenly became a status symbol in 1990s car bomb Russia.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you, so here we are now. So these forces, this unholy matrimony between American Christian nationalist fascists and Russian Christian nationalist fascists together in the White House and waging war against global democracy. What, in your view, is the way out of this? And what, if anything, is giving you hope right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, if I could back up a little bit there and just talk a little bit more about how that happened, I think the missionaries are a big part of that element of that too. And then there's a sort of broader project of trying to expand America's culture wars to other countries. Uganda, for example, very successful example from the right-wing, anti-democratic, anti-LGBTQ point of view. there's this exporting of American culture wars through these religious and cultural initiatives. There was this thing in Russia called the Co-Mission, major coalition of evangelical missionary organizations that they sent people over to ostensibly partner with the Russian Orthodox Church to develop an ethics curriculum to be used in Russian public schools. And it was used in some schools for a while. I don't know what kind of saturation it had. I don't know if anyone knows that. But this ethics curriculum was kind of a crypto-Protestant curriculum. It really focused on needing to believe the right things, and there was a lot of anti-gay stuff in there. It was 1994 to, I believe, 1998 or so. It broke down because the Russian Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox bishops, high-ranking priests, they're not stupid. They eventually realized that these people were hosting Bible studies and converting Orthodox Christians to evangelical Protestantism. So they're like, we don't like this. And they picked up on how they were selling this to like the audience at home in America that's funding it as a missionary project. And they were framing it to their Orthodox partners very differently. So it broke down. But this anti-abortion infrastructure, which took some time to have any impact in Russia for obvious reasons I don't think we need to go over. But eventually, like, Putin was like, okay, we can defund abortion, which was wild, right, in the context of Russia. And the Orthodox Church getting more influence. Partly this was through these partnerships, including the World Congress of Families, which was a big Russian-American project from its inception in 1994. And you get some of the really important influential people in these circles, where you get the Russians and Americans and European right-wingers together. They were heavily involved with that project. It came out of the sociology department of Moscow State University. And from one of these American right-wing sociologists, Alan Carlson, who had a little Center for Family Life, something like that, in Rockford, Illinois. And they created the World Congress of Families. This was a big place in the 90s and beyond for people, anti-democratic forces worldwide, to compare notes and talk about opposing women's rights, LGBTQ rights, supporting the, quote, natural family, patriarchal family, all this kind of stuff, and strategize and commingle. And I think these are actually really important institutions and just connections that bring people together. Out of that, you get somebody like Alexei Komov, who was, I think he still is, the right-hand man of Konstantin Malafeyev, God's oligarch, as it were. But there are seeds of this even before that. So if we talk about how evangelicals grasp for more power, they're largely responsible. I mean, it wasn't evangelical Ken Starr who did the whole...
Ken Starr of the Clinton investigation was an evangelical?
Yeah. So, if you want to talk about the Gingrich Revolution and that whole period, that's another period of further radicalization, I think. And Ken Starr doing this extreme sort of moralizing. And not that Bill Clinton is a good...
He was like a liability on his wife's career, too, with what he did with like the AG on the tarmac when she was running for president. Anyway, but go...
People
sorry.
Look at that and extreme hypocrisy. The evangelicals were all about this in the 90s, and now Trump does whatever, and they're like, it's fine. But on a deeper level, it's not hypocrisy, because it's always just about what's going to get them more power to implement their agenda, right? At first, many of them were uncomfortable with Trump, but he assuaged their fears by basically promising to do what they wanted him to do, which was, appoint justices to overturn Roe and, a number of other things, fight trans rights and so forth. And then he actually delivered. So kind of the culmination of this is Trump gives right-wing evangelicals more than any previous president, including George W. Bush. So a lot of people are, were saying back in 2016, like, oh, he's duped the evangelicals. Well, if anyone duped anyone, they duped him. But I think it's more just transactional on both sides. Like, he actually, they got a lot out of it, and they continue to get a lot out of it. And yes, they are happy about it. So yeah, there's all these elements going on, these institutions being founded where people can make these international ties. But even before that, I mean, there was some interest on the right in what Russians might be like if the Soviet Union fell. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn was over in the United States, obviously, having been expelled from the Soviet Union, right? And he gave like a university commencement speech in, I think, 1988. I think it was at Harvard. Forgetting the details, but this speech is like very... Western civilization is in decline. You need spiritual values. You look back at that speech, and to me, it's not surprising that Solzhenitsyn would go back to Russia under Putin and support Putin. And it's not surprising that he would win over evangelicals this way. I mean, some of the more educated and, want to be intellectual evangelicals also read Dostoevsky. And I think it makes perfect sense why Dostoevsky resonates with them, right? Because Dostoevsky became a Christian nationalist in the context of the Russian Empire. Let's put it that way. So there was this understanding that there are some Russians over there who are very susceptible to their views. And then I think from 1995, David Duke got an apartment in Moscow. He had it for a while, I think 10 years or so. He was looking to Russia as a place where white supremacy could thrive. So these ties are kind of coming together from everywhere. But I don't think you see rank and file evangelicals really praising Russia until, I didn't notice it anyway, until I was back from teaching in Moscow in 2013 with my family. And one of my uncles was like, good for Putin. It's really nice to see someone finally standing up to the gay agenda, And then I was like, oh, this is what we're doing now. But in retrospect, it makes sense. And then today, fast forward from 2014, when you've got all these sanctions passed on Russians, things get a little dicier, but obviously Russians are still having a huge influence directly in the United States on the conservative movement through the NRA, through the National Prayer Breakfast. Let's not forget Natalia Veselnitskaya and the Trump Tower meeting in, I think, June 2016. Maria Butina, who...
Russiagate, full force. And now here we are.
Now, it's less direct, and the attention is more to Viktor Orban and Hungary. And I mean, CPAC just happened in Hungary and Poland.